In the previous screencast, I discussed the Federal Reserve System and its history, gave an overview of the structure, and in this screencast, we're going a little bit more into depth of how the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which are privately owned, how they help to manipulate indirectly the money supply through the three tools of monetary policy. That include open market operations, the most commonly used tool, the reserve requirement, and the discount rate. So keep in mind macroeconomics, everything's related that you've learned this semester thus far. We don't want to forget about the business cycle even, and how both fiscal and monetary policies are used by different branches of the government to help lessen the negative effects of a free market or a mixed market system. So during expansion of the business cycle, tight policies implemented, of course, to control for the risk of inflation, and some different examples of what that may look like are provided on this slide, as well as loose policy and the unintended side effect of increased unemployment. So keep in mind that fiscal and monetary policies could be implemented at the same time, and they may appear to have different aims or objectives, and the consequences, the effects of the two policies may not be known until a period of time much after they're being implemented. So in this unit, we want to remember the tie-in that with changes in monetary policy, with shifts in the money market or in the market for loanable funds, with investment demand, there are going to be side effects that we should be able to graph on each of the three major macro graphs in this unit: the money market curve or curves, the loanable fund market curves, and the aggregate curves: aggregate demand, aggregate supply, long run, aggregate supply, and so on. So quickly, slides 3 and 4 show the relationship between these three major graphs. And so we have the supply and demand of money. The one thing that's not illustrated here is that we're dealing with nominal interest rates in the money market and real interest rates in the investment market, otherwise known as the market for loanable funds. So that's important to remember: real interest for loanable funds, nominal interest for the money market. So an increase in the money supply shifts the vertical money supply curve to the right on the money market graph, which then lowers interest rate because the demand of money hasn't changed. The decrease in interest rate can be seen as a shift along the loanable funds curve, demand for loanable funds. And when demand, the quantity demanded of loanable funds increases, interest rates have fallen, there's going to be more borrowing, more spending, thus aggregate demand increases and shifts to the right. So for FRQ purposes, this is very important to understand this, or these relationships, and the logical steps that occur after an increase or decrease in the change of the money supply. And so slide 5 shows the distinction when there's a decrease in the money supply. So when the Fed, through monetary policy, decreases the money supply indirectly, there's a change in investment demand, a shift in AD and AS, and ultimately real output decreases. So this must, of course, be part of tight policy because there is an inflationary gap, or because the economy is expanding perhaps too rapidly and there's fear of inflation. So today the Fed's functions fall into 4 basic categories. There's providing financial services to depository institutions, which I overviewed in the last screencast, supervising and regulating banks and other financial institutions like savings and loans as well, maintaining the stability of the financial system, and lastly conducting monetary policy. So we're going to focus on monetary policy and the 3 tools in the Fed's toolbox from this point on. So we want to zoom in here and remember what those tools are. The most commonly used is the open market operations tool. And so as we distinguish between these three tools. Just keep that in mind. In review, the three shifters of the money supply are actually the three tools of the Federal Reserve. Setting the reserve requirement ratio, lending money to banks and thrifts, which is affected by what's called the discount rate or the Fed rate, the federal funds rate, and then there are open market operations, buying and selling bonds. So these three shifters could cause the money supply to increase, shifting to the right, in the money market graph, or decrease, shifting to the left. So in U.S. history, you may have discussed bank runs and the impact that the panic had on financial recessions in 1907 and again in 1929 with the stock market crash and subsequently following Great Depression. The reserve requirement is the first tool of monetary policy, and so this image, which we've seen this chart before, which shows the amount to be loaned, the amount that the bank must put on reserve, the excess reserves, this is the amount to loan. Okay, this dollar value here is determined by the reserve ratio, and this reserve requirement is established by the Fed. So to overview, the slide 10, spells out the characteristics of the reserve requirement. So I'm going to pause the video now, give you a chance to read over that. Okay, so you can see what is required to be held in the required reserves cannot be loaned out. And that's the key thing to remember. So let's say currently the reserve ratio may be 10% for checkable bank deposits. That means that, of course, 90% could be loaned out in excess reserves. Banks that fail to maintain at least the required reserve ratio, that 10%, over, I think it's like a 2-week period, will face penalties by the Federal Reserve. All right, so what does a bank do if it looks as if it has insufficient reserves to meet the Fed's reserve requirement? Well, what it would do then is borrow. In a short-term situation, banks can borrow from other banks. And the Fed also has influence over this lending from bank to bank using what's called the federal funds rate. So there is a market in and of itself, the federal funds market, which exists as a financial market that allows banks that fall short of the reserve requirement to borrow reserves, usually just overnight, from banks that are holding any excess reserves available. So the interest rate in this market is determined by supply and demand, but the supply and demand for bank reserves are strongly affected by Federal Reserve actions. And we'll discuss the federal funds rate a little bit later on, the discount rate. Just keep in mind, this is an interest rate at which funds are borrowed and lent to federal funds market, which is essentially where banks are borrowing from other banks to meet the required reserve. The money multiplier explains how the excess reserves that banks lend can lead to a much larger expansion of the money supply eventually. And so this is the exact same concept that we learned in the previous unit on the spending multiplier and the taxation multiplier. So the formula is a little different. The formula is 1 over the reserve requirement. Sometimes it's seen as just 1 over R or 1 over RR, which is a ratio, which means it's a percentage expressed as a decimal. So 20% for reserve requirement would be expressed, as you can see down here, as 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2 equals a money multiplier of 5. So if excess reserves increase by $2 billion, all right, how much will money supply increase is the question down at the bottom here of the slide. You would multiply the money multiplier 5 by the initial increase in excess reserves, which of course would give you $10 billion increase in the money supply. So you can see by using the money multiplier how the Fed indirectly affects the money supply through the reserve requirement. Okay, again, the challenge in AP Macro and the FRQ is to communicate that you understand monetary policy, in particular when the Fed is trying to indirectly affect the money supply, perhaps through changing the reserve requirement. which doesn't happen very often, but you still would need to understand the relationship. So slide 13 walks you through that. If there's a recession, the Fed needs expansionary policy. All right, so we want to lower the reserve ratio, meaning that the required reserve percentage would decrease, therefore the excess reserve percentage would increase. Banks hold less money and have more excess reserves, then they would create more money by lending out more of the excess reserves, or more of the increased excess reserves that they now have. And this gradually increases the money supply. We know that then interest rates would fall and aggregate demand would increase. And that goes back to several slides previous in which we saw the relationship between the money market, the loanable funds market, where interest rates are, and the aggregate graph as well. As part of the explanation on the reserve requirement, I mentioned the federal funds market and the federal funds rate. Those two concepts are interrelated. The federal funds rate is different from the discount rate, but they are similar. The similarity is that the discount rate and the federal funds rate are both interest rates. When banks need to borrow to meet their required reserve requirement, and they're unable to do so because they haven't received enough demand deposits in a given day or something, then they can borrow from one another. And when banks do that, again, that's in the federal funds market. These two concepts, the discount rate and the federal funds rate, are unique in that the discount rate is specifically talking about the interest rate on which the Fed charges commercial banks if commercial banks need to borrow from the Fed. The Federal Reserve System is referred to by bankers as the lender of last resort. Banks don't like to borrow from the Fed because there is this negative stigma attached to that action. Stockholders in the bank may see that as a warning sign that things aren't going so well. So literally, the Fed does charge a higher rate, and the discount rate is typically set about 1 percentage point above the federal funds rate as really a disincentive for banks to want to borrow directly from the Fed. So the discount rate, as we learned with the first tool of monetary policy, the reserve requirement, is an interest rate. Therefore, it acts as an incentive or a disincentive either to increase lending or decrease it, depending on the cost of money needed to, of course, increase the amount of loans possible. All right, so the example here says that the Bank of America needs $10 million. They borrow it from the U.S. Treasury, which the Fed controls, but they must pay the bank with 3% interest. This 3% interest is the discount rate. So if that rate increases, then that would decrease the money supply. That would be an example of tight money policy. And of course, if this rate were to decrease, then that would be an example of easy or expansionary policy, because banks would not be so slow to borrow if they needed to increase their excess reserves. All right, the most commonly used monetary policy tool is open market operations. And this is quite literally the Federal Reserve buying and selling treasury bonds or T-notes or T-bills to commercial banks primarily, to American investors or foreign investors, to help finance the federal government. So rather than to simply buy bonds from the government, which is essentially like printing money to pay off the budget deficits, the Fed chooses to avoid the risk of inflation or hyperinflation by doing so, and rather buys through open market operations from commercial banks directly. So to increase the money supply, the Fed would buy government securities, that is, injecting cash in exchange for individuals who are holding bonds in the bond market. It's literally a cash injection. And selling those securities is giving out these bonds, which are IOUs, and pulling money from circulation, decreasing that M1 indirectly. I would encourage you to work the practice on slide 16, which helps you understand the relationship between the interest rates, discount rate, federal funds rate, reserve requirement, and the money multiplier as well.